the crazy thing about affordable housing is when times are good, the need goes up, and when times are bad, the need goes up.
My name is Ben Charland. You're listening to What on Earth is Going On. My guest this week is Teresa Goldstein, Manager of Community Planning for the City of Calgary. Now, that mostly means affordable housing, but she has been an urban planner for over 25 years, and her career is fascinating because it follows change and the idea of a city changing, the cities themselves changing, and the transformative process being seen over decades, generations, even centuries. Calgary is where she does her work, and if there's a city that can encompass change in a very short period of time, it's Calgary. Now, change is the theme of this episode, through the lens of the city. We talk about the change as a result of COVID-19. We talk about the difficulty of changing things in a large organization or government. We talk about technological innovation and the idea of planning change versus change happening organically, and the benefits of very long-term planning, whether it's 50 years or even 100 years. Now, if you like this conversation, please give it a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. You can also go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca, to find a way to reach out to me by email or on social media. Let me know what you think of this episode or any other, and of course, tell me who you think should be on the show and what you think we should be talking about. As usual, let me know what on earth you think is going on. Teresa Goldstein, welcome to the program.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for having me.
It's a real privilege to have you. I'm excited to chat with you about a number of different things, whether it's affordable housing, urban planning, and the Calgary-specific context in which you work, which is a city that I'm obviously interested in. I'm from Calgary, and I'll probably be a Calgarian until my dying day, even if I don't currently live there. So there's a lot I want to dig into. But I've got to go with the first question, as always, which is a deliberately broad question to get a deliberately broad response from you. Not just about the things I just mentioned, affordable housing and city design, but on a broader scale, what is happening in our world today? What are the forces that are driving us forward? What are the things that maybe we don't recognize are happening that are changing our lives, even if we don't recognize it? And so there are many things to this question that are obvious, and there are probably some things that are not so obvious. But to you, this question goes, Teresa, what on earth is going on?
Yeah, and for me, it is such an exciting time in city planning, city building. We are in this, especially in Calgary, but I would say across Canada, we're in this really interesting time where people are changing the way that they live like no other time. I've been doing this for 20 years, mostly in southern Alberta, British Columbia, but I started my career in Ontario. And I've never seen so many people using the city, especially Calgary, like they are today. So biking, like what in the world is happening? There is like this crazy response to the world that we're in right now, which is like forced people to find these little pieces of heaven, which is what I call them, where they can go outside and have this experience. And that's changing the way we plan our cities and changing the way we conceptualize how we use space. And what's super exciting for me is like the urbanists of Canada, there's like 7,000 urban planners, urban designers in Canada. We've been thinking about this forever, right? This is like what gets us up in the morning and what makes what we do not a job, but a lifestyle. But now people are like, oh my gosh, Teresa, I went to this really cool space on the weekend and it had like a patio that was, socially distanced, and I rode my bike there and there was a little market, and I'm like, yeah, like what I've been saying to you for the last couple of years that is amazing about our city. People are getting it. And because of that, it's making, I think all levels of government, I obviously like work at the municipal level, but I think it's making us all like wake up to this user experience driving planning outcomes rather than it being like policy and top down driving outcomes. So I think like what's happening in this world is that we are starting in Canada, especially Calgary, we're starting to use our space like we never have, and then that's like making it super exciting for us to live in this city. And right now we're in a fortunate time of the year where it's like the most beautiful 6 days of the entire year of summer. It's not always like this, and so I think people are like, let's get outside, let's experience this Calgary. And then it makes me feel vulnerable because I'm like, oh my goodness, people are seeing like the work that we've been putting in over the last 20 years and seeing some of the challenges that are there. But then they're also seeing all of these incredible niches all over the city and saying, you know, like, this is how I want to experience my city. This is how I want to live and to work and to play. And it's really exciting. I don't know. You can probably hear it through my voice.
I know I can for sure. And I'm really glad you mentioned that you guys have been working on these problems for 20 plus years, but you know, many people for decades and decades beyond that. I mean, city planning and the whole conceptualization of the city has been pretty, you know, lockstep with human development for thousands of years. Obviously,
Yeah.
since the Industrial Revolution, we've taken a different track. And obviously, again, since the digital revolution, we are reconceptualizing the city. But what's interesting about the COVID-19 pandemic of many things is that it seems to be accelerating trends that are already in place. So home delivery of goods, remote working, conversations like this that we're having.
Yeah, totally.
You know, technology that allows people to live and work in completely different places than they would have expected to 20, 30, 40 years ago. These are fascinating things that were already happening. And as you say, this is kind of putting your ideas into practice almost all of the sudden. But,
and on super speed. Like,
right.
I would say like Calgary actually is a baby if we think about how young our city is compared to cities around the world. If we think of things in like hundreds of years, Calgary is one, right? So I think like this pandemic has taught us that we have the ability to really influence how we live in small pieces all over our city, and we can try things out and be really nimble that way. I was joking with a colleague the other day, this transition to online in big workforces could take 5 years of change management, right? Like that's how it works in big organizations. I think we did it in 3 weeks and we were just like, this is incredible. There's hiccups, but everyone recognizes that. And so for city building, we can really right now, I'm not even calling piloting things. I'm calling it prototyping things, because that means that we can fail and we can adjust. And it's like not wasting money. It's actually learning from how the user experiences those things. And so Memorial Drive closure so that people can experience that space for half of the time on their bikes and being able to ride along there rather than just the vehicle experience was something that we just had to try out to see how that works. And sometimes we're going to have to adjust it, and sometimes we're going to have to say, this is how we want our city to be.
That has certainly been a theme too, is this idea that it takes a long time for large organizations. We often single out government, but there have been some scholars that have shown that organizations like Walmart really operate like large public scale entities because they take a long time to change, but they also internally work almost like a socialist government would. With a managed economy, right? So within the supply chain of Walmart, they're not leaving things to the economy and to the free market. Walmart is deciding where they're going to send things and what they're going to do with their distribution and their supply chains. It's an interesting academic exercise to think about that, but we've also realized that these large organizations take a long time to change. The classic idea of a ship turning in the ocean takes a long time. This is something that's often referenced in the federal governments in Canada and the United States. But what we see is that when it has to turn quickly, when there's no other option, it does. Education is another example of this. It's a fascinating theme that we're experiencing, but it's also showing us the rapidity of change all across the board, not just in government. And one thing that is changing, and some people who work in urban planning are talking about, is that ever since really the 1990s, we've almost taken intensification for granted. Sort of like at the same time as the fall of the Berlin Wall, this assumption of the ascendancy of Western liberalism as the only true form of the future. At the same time, we've just assumed that people want to live in the middle of cities. As cities become cleaned up or crime is reduced and become more beautified, people want to be close to arts and culture. They want to be close to work. They want to be able to bike or walk to work as opposed to drive for half an hour from the suburbs. And this intensification, which intersects with so many other areas, including affordable housing, social development, social welfare, but also the financial management of cities. You know, if everything is in the suburbs and not actually part of the city proper, and Calgary doesn't really have this problem like other cities do, it creates massive issues such as that like Detroit has faced over the years. And I guess what I'm trying to get to is there is one aspect of this change that we aren't sure is a good thing. For example, if you can work from anywhere, and in the midst of a pandemic, it's no longer appealing to be in the middle of a city in an apartment building. We've actually seen prices of homes go way down in the inner city in many places, and cottage country, say outside of Toronto, go way up, because people are not only thinking for the next 6 months, they're thinking for the next 20 years as pandemics become more and more common. This reversal of intensification that we took for granted. What if that, first of all, I guess I would ask you, Teresa, if that's true, but second of all, if it is true, what does that mean for social programs, social welfare, and affordable housing?
Yeah, and the interesting piece about that is it's predicated on having a diverse housing choice available to people, um, a diverse transportation modes available to people, and the basically the financial and the economic means available. And so I would say for a very small portion of our society that is able to satisfy those three things from anywhere in the world, that certainly is becoming a factor. But the reality remains that in Calgary specifically, we have a very narrow amount of housing choice in our city, just because of the way that our city, like it's not saying that one housing form is better than the other. It was by virtue of our market and the way that our city grew, especially in the 1950s, single detached dwellings were being produced and have dominated our housing choice here. And over time, since the 90s, like you said, there has been quite a shift to try and bring other forms of housing into our city to help that affordability perspective. But for a long time, that didn't exist. We had programs that were rolled out over our country that tried to get more rental across our country. That was a very small segment here in Calgary. We, at the time in the early 2000s until most recently, we've had like 3 to 4% of rental stock in our city, which has driven where people live, right? Because that's, in some cases, people are saying, okay, I will rent a home that's near to my work because then I won't own a car, or I will only own one car as opposed to 2 cars for our family. So I would say there's probably 2 things that are going on right now in our city. Is certainly people are deciding where they want to live based on, not solely based on where they work, but how they want to experience their city, whether it's taking transit to their workplace, or whether it's being able to quickly hop on your bike and go into the workplace. And right now, because of that, like slower, not even slower, but the youngness of our city, some of our systems are just not built yet. And so Transit's like a really good example in our city, where we have our lowest housing costs in our city. We have our highest transportation costs. So the city of Calgary, the one that I work for, our municipal government, we've done a lot of work to see how we can lower those costs of housing. And that seems to be by bringing employment closer to those areas. So if people can work closer to where they live, then obviously their transportation costs go down.
There's another aspect to Calgary too that is really interesting and perhaps makes it maybe more vulnerable to this shift, whether it's short-term or long-term, which is the rate of home ownership, right? I've read before, and I don't know if this is true or just from a particular angle, that Calgary, similar to Oslo, has one of, if not the highest rate of home ownership for a full city in the world. And that causes very interesting dilemmas for affordable housing, but obviously for the shift away when people are, not only rooted in their community in a very different way than you would be as a renter. How does that home ownership rate affect your work and affect the questions that we're grappling with right now?
Yeah, that's a really good that's actually a really interesting part of the work that we do. So tenure, homeownership versus rental, is typically not something that we get into every day, because when we look at how communities build out, we would expect that there would be a mix between home tenureship. What's happened over time, though, is that our private market actually does a really good job from an affordability perspective as well, of providing what people in Calgary have needed over time. So I saw a couple years ago that the private market actually was giving up to 80%. It was satisfying about 80% of the needs. So 20% of Calgarians were renting, and about 6% were in this pie that could not afford rents and could not afford to purchase. And so that 6% was really where we were trying to do some significant work in increasing rental, increasing that housing choice, so that people that were in that pie, that part that were renting, could either move into other rental that they preferred, or into home ownership over time. What is interesting, though, now that we are starting to, like earlier on in our conversation, starting to grow up a little bit, we've noticed communities that have predominantly single family homes in them. The people there are like, well, now what am I going to do? Like, I'm 55 years old. I want to downsize, whether that's purchasing a townhome or renting a townhome or purchasing a condo, and I can't find anything in my neighborhood. And they're saying to the city, well, why aren't we seeing that happening in our neighborhoods? And one of the biggest obstacles, I would say, for that is that inner city or established area redevelopment has been very hard in our city. We've had a significant time where communities were very, they were passionate about the composition of their community at the time. And at the same time, their kids were growing up and starting to move out. And then we heard, 15 years ago or 10 years ago now, think about the narrative that happened. Our schools started to close in our established areas, right? Because we didn't have enough people to go to them. That's like a big sign to urban planners when our school boards start coming to us and telling us that they want to get rid of assets. That's a big sign in our field to say to communities, okay, guys, like in 10 years, you are going to need a different housing choice in your neighborhood. And lo and behold, in 10 years, communities that were very, very vocal in our city against those townhouses are now saying, okay, well, now we have to leave our communities, and we don't want to. And secondary suites, despite it taking so long to be able to roll out across our city, has seen a significant uptake as a result of this, because community members are now saying, okay, well, yeah, we agree. It wasn't it wasn't like a big bad beast that we thought it was going to be. It was very gentle in our neighborhood. We don't have, there was a thought that there was going to be like every single house on streets would have secondary suites. There has not been that kind of uptake. And now what we're seeing is that the kind of first donut outside of our center city is seeing intense development and redevelopment pressures because communities outside of that have not reached that maturity level yet to see that kind of redevelopment.
Is there a point at which a city is mature, or the communities of a city are so mature that they become not immune to, but resistant to this cycle? Whereas, for example, in a new community in Calgary, it's built today, and all these new families move in. It's the kind of community that wants single families, detached dwelling, one family with 2 or 3 kids and a dog. And then 40 years later, all the kids have left and the parents are there hanging on to these large properties, partly because they own these properties. They're less incentivized to leave and go rent somewhere else into a community that would be more fitting for them. That sounds like a process that just happens over and over again in Calgary. But are there cities in the world, or even communities in Calgary, that are so old that has been broken, where that cycle happens, but it happens all through the age of the community? So you have a complete mix of people. Or is that a myth that can't be achieved in a place like Calgary?
No, I think that's a great question, actually. And our new communities are actually doing a really good job of this. So what's happened, so if we think about Calgary as being those like rings or those donuts outside of our central business district, the first couple of rings outside the downtown are experiencing intense redevelopment right now. And then we have a ring that is that sweet spot where the families are still there, the children are still living at home, and there was some initial development that provided, seniors housing or some other forms. And then our new communities, the ones that have been happening since 2011, 2010, are actually much higher density than the ring that's immediately inner to them. And not only are they higher density, but the housing choice in those areas is consistent with our 2009 policies of our municipal development plan, which is our North Star. Like, our city works off of our municipal development plan, which said in 2009 that we would like to have a hybrid model of growth that has, some growth happening on the outside of our city and some growth happening on the inside of our city. And how we balance that is that we work with those developers to say, on day one, you might not sell like 4-story apartments to the people that are buying those single detached, but in 40 years, those people that want to stay in their neighborhood are then going to move into those areas. And the people that are getting into the market the first time are buying those condos or those townhomes now, and then saying, I love living in this area. I'm going to stay here and I'm going to move into these other homes that are being built right now.
I just want to take us Teresa, to a higher altitude in this conversation.
Of course.
About planning. So you just mentioned these plans that are your North Star from 11 years ago. Yep. When we look at city planning, we talk about 50-year plans, 100-year plans. When we look at transportation plans for a city, just because it takes so long to construct these networks, but also to envision them and have them react to the changing of populations, we're looking at decades at a time, which is fascinating. And obviously, you're an urban planner. That's in the title of your job description, in the title of your education, this word plan. But to what extent is this a balance between obviously planning, but also organically responding and allowing things to happen? I mean, if you plan a community properly, as you were just saying, you can bring in people from different walks of life to create a balance from the beginning of a community that will last for 40, 50, 60 years later. But to what extent are we just allowing, and this is, I guess, a question about market forces as much as it is about just people's interests, which change over time, especially in an accelerated age that we're living in now with technology, pandemics, education, whatever it is. How do you manage this balance between planning and just the organic evolution of people's needs, wants, desires of where they want to live, work, and play?
Yeah, that's probably like the crux of all planning, is to say, like, how rigid or how much policy do we need to help us get to where we're going, and then how much do we want to rely on that human element or that innovation element to come through and to help us shape what we're doing. And I think here we we are in a unique position where we are able to work with, we don't have that many developers in our city that are doing land development. And so I think, like, relatively speaking to other major cities in Canada that have, people coming from all over the world, we don't have a ton of people in that area. So I think over time we've developed an incredible relationship with our building industry and with our partners, and that has allowed us to think about how to shape things more nimbly, to look at community build out over a 50-year period. Like some places of in our city, we have a land supply that is really like that long, like 40 years from the first time that they'll be putting shovels in the ground. And we know that communities change over that time. A really good example recently that is super exciting for city planners, city nerds like me, is we're seeing the conversion of some multifamily right now back to single detached, but these what they call large, like multi-generational housing, where we're planning, even though it's only like, if from a city planning perspective we would be like, oh, it's only one home, but there are like 3 or 4 different families that are living in this single home, and like working on that kind of communal, like kibbutz type of environment where some people are working and some people are staying at home and looking after their family members. And we're seeing that as being a result of that innovation, as a result of that, like, organic growing up in parts of neighborhoods. The other thing that's really interesting too is the impact of cultural elements in city planning. And I am by no means an expert in this area. Most of my expertise is really in land development around and policy development, but the cultural element is coming through when we look at things like I just explained, like different cultures. I am Italian, and my family certainly is that sandwich generation where my parents are in a suite behind my home, and my children still live in my home with me. And so we have purposely planned the way that we are going to live over the next 20 years and chose the neighborhood that we wanted to live in based on that cultural element that my family had when we were growing up. And so I think that's part of it. And then the last thing I think is just changes in technology. And so I think over time, we're going to see an incredible amount of change when it comes to how much space things take. Water treatment is like something I've always thought, like, when you look and you're driving down the Deerfoot and you look over and you see these like large swaths of area that is just being used to treat water over time, like, I suspect we're not going to need that kind of stuff. We're going to see a change in the way that we do things. And then that will get us into a place where we'll say, okay, well, what's a better use of land in this area to do that, where we historically would have just had standing water. So
one of the key themes for Teresa's work is providing housing choice and a diversity of choice in a city like Calgary, which is often defined as very narrow or simply single detached. Now, coming up in this conversation, we talk about a very interesting choice that can be taken in a city, strip malls, something we don't usually think of as a good place to be, but in fact, these places can be the best incubators in a city like Calgary or anywhere else, and the reason for that is quite interesting. That's coming up on this episode of What on Earth is Going On. You mentioned water treatment, and there's a few other obvious examples, but what are some things that, in terms of technology, that have changed over the course of your career that either we can notice on the surface or we can't, but are changing or have already changed the way that our cities are built?
Well, I think like transportation for sure. When I first started, we had never heard of a cycle track or a separated space for people to exist on the street. The streets were for cars, the sidewalks were for people, and there was a really gray area about like who bikes and where bikes go. And now I would say like technology has allowed us to say, you know, if we want to create environments that families and people will use and feel safe, then we need to provide this infrastructure. And so that's certainly one. The other thing that I've seen change significantly over my career is how we program parks. I would say like 25 years ago in Ottawa, I worked in for the city of Ottawa when I first started my career. We had a very strict template of how we programmed parks. It was like play fields, ball diamonds, and a climber. Now we are seeing like incredible changes in how we have gone back to what I call wild play. It's like the most exciting parts of the city are always those like untouched, wild places that don't have a lot of planning put into them. And that's the places kids want to go. And that's the places like families certainly want to experience. And so I think like technology has really helped us get to a place where the risk of people getting hurt has really been mitigated by having like the incredible imagination when it comes to programming these spaces. And so I think like if I was looking back 25 years ago and said, like, Teresa, you're gonna be super excited about like a wild play area that has like trees and logs on the ground, and your kids would want to spend every moment there, I would say I was crazy. Kids only want to go on swings, and and skate parks. Like, think about the like alternative type of recreation that people have been doing for a very long time, but is now so prevalent. I think there's 12 skateboarding parks under construction right now in our city, or in various stages of opening, because that's something that our public is saying, like, they want these spaces. And it's not a space for people like delinquents, like that was painted 20 years ago. People that skateboarded were seen as this weird subculture. It's totally mainstream and being embraced. And that investment that cities are making into recreation will show you that.
On this conversation about technology, what do you think about smart cities, so-called smart cities that are incredibly connected with data, the internet of things, taking in millions of data points, like they were developing in Toronto, which I think is no longer happening on the waterfront in Toronto. But this idea that you can have a city that is invisible to most people, is collecting data on what you're putting in your shopping cart, let alone how quickly you cross the street. There are concerns about privacy with smart cities, but they also seem to be an inevitable path forward for the future of the city.
This idea of having so much data at our fingertips it's like a blessing and a curse at the same time, right? Like, I'll never forget joining a team, being on this like super savvy, like all kinds of multidisciplinary team. We're doing an investigation and people get stuck in that cycle because there's so much data. For me, for my field, I think it's important for us to understand what are those habits, like what's happening in retail, what's happening in recreation, because like the worst disservice that you can do is create this phenomenal community and nobody wants to live there because it doesn't really reflect what people want. But certainly there is like that fine line where we have to think about privacy and the work that we do, and how much sometimes the decisions that are those like really hard decisions that you have to fight for they're certainly rooted in good data, but some of it I think comes from your gut and comes from saying, like, the next evolution of this area, like mini malls is a great example. I read this incredible article the other day about how for probably the last 10 years, people have been saying like the death of the mini mall. People aren't going to strip malls anymore, but that the strip mall actually was like your incubator, that like the people that had ideas and entrepreneurs would go to the strip mall and try them out there. And so if we don't have like cheap retail space that entrepreneurs can go and offer something unique, then are we actually quashing our creative economy? And how like the mini mall or like our strip malls are tied to that, and the work that we do in providing that. And like, I mean, I'm the person that says like, oh, well, we need to intensify that and we don't need so much parking, but we also need to keep costs very low so that we can facilitate that creative culture and that change that happens in those areas. So I think, getting on a tangent from our original question, like technology is driving our decisions for sure, but it's only one part of that. And city planning is like that science that is both qualitative and quantitative at the same time. And so technology, I think, can really complement that, but is certainly just one piece.
Well, it's interesting, we're talking in a way about ideas that can be counterintuitive. The idea that a strip mall can actually be an incubator for discovery, entrepreneurship, innovation, when most of us just see it as the crappy part of town, where it's really just a parking lot where you kind of go in and out as quick as you can to get a loaf of bread or something from the drugstore. But actually what you're saying is, because they are low-end, cheap retail, they allow for something we don't expect. So the solution may actually be in the problem. This is something that came up in my conversation for the podcast with Terry O'Reilly, who is the famous CBC broadcaster who does Under the Influence and talks about marketing. And he's obsessed with finding counterintuitive ideas. And one thing that I discovered, I've lived in many cities, and I lived in London, England for a while. And what was so interesting there is that wherever you thought was the worst part of town, the highest crime, the crappiest food, the kind of the ugliest buildings, would just wait 10 years and that would be the place to be. And so real estate people knew this and they would start buying property there. But the reason for that is because it was so cheap, because it was so run down and cheap. That's where the artists went, because they were usually the not paid as well. So they would go there and make it cool. The interesting people would go to the cheaper parts of town, make them cool, and in no time, they were the place to be. I remember when I lived in London, Peckham was the worst place to be, and now apparently people tell me that it is like the up-and-coming neighborhood. I think that's fascinating. But
think about the East Village.
Yes,
the East Village is like your example to the T. Like, you're a native Calgarian. I've lived here for over 20 years. My husband is a third generation Calgarian. I remember moving here and he was like, "Oh, Teresa, that place, the East Village, is pretty rough." And now we go there on the weekend for like the best cup of coffee and loaf of bread in the city. So,
and some of the most interesting buildings, some of the most interesting spaces, projects.
Yeah.
The places where what entrepreneur or creative person wouldn't want to be in the East Village today or Peckham in London today? And I think that it's a very interesting question, but it actually raises another question, which to me is about churn, or gentrification and the constant change that cities go through. And there's another angle I wanted to take on this, which is, I don't have a TV and I haven't watched cable television probably since I was 19. But when I stay in a hotel, it's there, and it's kind of fun for my wife and I to turn it on and just see the garbage. And it's really bad, the stuff that is on television. However, one channel that we watched was HGTV, which is like the home improvement channel or something. And it's constantly people redoing houses all day long, show after show after show of people like tearing them. And of course, they always show the sledgehammer going through the wall. That's probably the favorite part of people watching. But I realized that there's this constant churn. And a lot of these houses they're redeveloping are only a few years old. And I wondered, as I was watching it, what the social ramifications are of that. what the social ramifications are. Maybe the East Village isn't a great example with this one because that took a long time to happen. But when a neighborhood goes from the worst part of town to the best in 5 years, that kind of churn puts people out on their bums. Like it sends people packing from housing that was once affordable to what is now completely out of their league. And when it happens quickly, there's no time for people to adjust. So I just wondered, and you're the manager of community planning for the city of Calgary, and social welfare is obviously a big part of your work. So what is the social ramification of all of this churn, especially when it's happening so quickly in the modern world?
Yeah, that's an incredible, I think, dissertation of what happens in cities across the world. And certainly affordability is probably our number one, alongside with like community compatibility. That's what we're thinking about. Where we've seen massive redevelopments in major Canadian cities across the country, we have seen good investment into other forms of housing that help keep some affordability there for people that were either in the area or were elsewhere. So the city of Toronto, the city of Vancouver, the city of Montreal, they have very good handles on mixing affordable housing, like non-market housing with market housing. The city of Calgary right now, we haven't been there yet. What we work towards is kind of like a sector approach. So about 5-6 years ago now, the whole non-market housing sector came together to say, we have a big problem here, and we want to solve it together rather than it just being like these one-offs. And what that has meant is that, the city, we work to provide the pieces of the puzzle that those other people were missing. So land is a very hard piece. Like what your scenario was saying is that developers come in, they redevelop a neighborhood, the rents go up, the land values go up. And so it's hard to keep affordability down. And so what the city did a couple of years ago is we created a program to help that affordability piece. And so we actually dispose of pieces of city land at below market value to other affordable housing providers so that they can keep that affordability in these neighborhoods. And oftentimes that land is in established neighborhoods that we've done projects in, or we have other infrastructure that we've put together and we haven't needed as much. So fire stations is a really good example. And the city has been working to try and redevelop those sites and provide either the land that's left over or on top of the fire station itself for affordable housing. So that's one of the ways that we've been working. But as a sector, I think the idea of continuing to work to when redevelopment comes in to say, you're proposing to do, all this one type of housing, like, have you thought about varying that up so that housing choice is probably the number one driver of affordability? And because some neighborhoods are like, predominantly one, it really excludes a huge segment of our population. And so housing choice is probably the big piece of my job that I've been doing over the last 20 years, is just saying to new land developers, or as on the side that I work on, applicants coming in to say, where is that? And how have you thought about this? Or have you thought about, partnering up with an organization that can purchase units in perpetuity from you and do those pre-sales? Like, that makes sense to have that partnership.
So with your work, and obviously the work the city of Calgary does with affordable housing specifically, you're talking about, essentially being a connector between people and opening up possibilities so that developers know maybe is available to them that they might not know before. Are you also taking a carrot and stick approach? Are there incentives and disincentives that you're taking? Or is the city of Calgary, stepped back from that business and is simply being an enabler in this space?
No, I think that carrot approach is a really good analogy, because on top of land, the other thing that the city had said is we have the ability to expedite approvals, so make a fast track where it's in like the society's or the community's best interest. And so affordable housing was one. So right now when we receive an application, it actually gets like a different status, and it goes through our approval system faster, because we recognize obviously that time is money. And the longer that something is not churning, but the longer that something is in the system, it's not being built, or they have carrying costs. So that's one way that the city said, this is within our own wheelhouse, and we have the ability to save time. The other thing that we did very, very early is we created this like a coordinator inside the city for all affordable housing applications. So that person has been tasked to kind of shepherd the applications through. So the faster stream that they get, plus they get this affordable housing coordinator, has meant that probably over the last, since 2016, we've seen an incredible amount of units that have come through. It is nowhere near what the city of Calgary needs, though. I had a funny saying when I worked in my previous role as the manager of affordable housing, that I just wanted to get to average, and I never want to strive for average. That is not Teresa Goldstein to strive for average, but to strive for average. So the city of Calgary to become average for the amount of affordable housing to the rest of the Canadian cities, we needed 15,000 new units. 15,000 is a crazy lofty goal just to get to average. So I said, guys, I don't even want to strive for better. I just want to strive to be average. And that program, the Affordable Housing Coordinator and the disposal of the land and having those expedited approvals really helped. And then there was one last thing that the city did, which I thought was really, really good. It had great results, is they did a fee waiver as well. So they said, again, what's in our wheelhouse to try and influence supply is to be able to cut the fees. So now we're stacking the programs on top of each other. We're saying you're going to get a fast approval. You're going to get someone that shepherds it through. We're going to work with you to see if we can provide land at our book cost, and we're going to waive your fees. And so those are the little pieces that actually got a lot of projects that just needed that little nudge off the ground. I think there was over 2,000 units right away. So as soon as we opened up that program, 2,000 units came through, and that was a backlog because there were projects that were sitting on shelves for many years that were saying, I just needed this last little bit to get over, and the fee waiver was what got them over, or the land piece was what got them over. So that was incredibly successful.
Yeah, something that's interesting, using Calgary as sort of a microcosm or an explainer of a city in isolation, is that it's always going through a period of bust or boom. It seems to be always rising or falling, or at least that's the narrative that we're receiving about it, right? And so when it's rising, there are problems about rapid growth, but when it's falling, there are obviously problems with that. In which period is affordable housing and social welfare through housing more difficult for you as an urban planner? Is it when the city is growing and bursting at the seams, or was when the city is in a period of recession and economic difficulty?
Yeah, the crazy thing about affordable housing is when times are good, the need goes up, and when times are bad, the need goes up. So there is no period where affordable housing levels out. So when times are great, this rental supply goes down to zero, right? Because the rents themselves go way up. And then it really squeezes that last little bit where people are saying, okay, I can take my bike to work instead of of driving, I'll sell my car and I can still afford my rent. What happens when times are good is there's like, I actually have to choose between eating and having an apartment. And so that's really like what we're talking about here. And then when times are bad, obviously, like you can see over the last number of years, our unemployment rate has gone up. So our the same goes for people losing their homes and having those needs of those social systems in place to support people that were either in homeownership that now go into rental, which then displaces those people that were in rental to either further rental or back into homelessness. And so one of the, I think, the things that we've seen that can help stabilize housing the best, well, is that supply and about predictability and predictable supply. And so over time, I mean, we talked about this at the beginning. In the 90s, there was incredible programs and incredible funding that happened from our federal government through our provincial governments to get a lot of units built. And you can see them. They look almost the same in every city you go to. They're a large brown building with like a tan colored balcony. You've seen these buildings. And those were all created, 40 years ago, between 20 and 40 years ago, through the federal programs. What happened after that is we actually were in a period of time for many years where we didn't have a national housing strategy. And then a number of years ago, we had a renewed national housing strategy. And that's where you see big investment into what they call co-investment funds. And the co is really where cities, provincial governments, and federal governments have come together, because it's dependent on all those programs that I just talked about as being the investment from the municipal side. And then there are provincial investments that are, required somewhere in there. And then those federal investments. And that supply piece, I think we are at such an incredible time because we have a huge office vacancy and a huge redevelopment opportunity that's coming to us. And I know just in the news maybe the beginning of August, I heard that there was incredible hotel conversions to rental apartments that are happening across Calgary. And we're just starting to see the first applications come in right now that shows how this can be done. And that's a huge opportunity to help that affordability. So it's it's neat times.
It's interesting because in the midst of difficulty and uncertainty, there's opportunity as usual. And it's people like you who can see the innovation, but are also capable of, making those connections that make it exciting. Teresa, my last question to you is, if, we talked about a lot of different things, but if there was one thing that you wish we had another hour to dig into, and one more question we could address, if there was only one, what would that one thing be?
Yeah, that's oh, Ben, you've stumped me. There's so many things that I would love to have a discussion about. One of the things that has really, really interested me is this idea of turning people that were previously not in my backyards to yes in my backyards. And cities like Portland, Seattle, Washington, D.C., New York, those places have had these incredible grassroots movements when they've had incredible housing pressures and economic pressures to come together as communities and say, we want to live in our neighborhoods forever, and we want to see change, and this change looks like this. And I still don't see that happening here at the City of Calgary. I see a lot of passionate neighborhoods that are still just beginning to feel that grown up. I'll never forget when we opened the new library downtown, and we got the New York Times and McLean's, but the New York Times coming in and saying, this is like in the top 5 buildings to see in the world. And to me, it felt like we were in this incredible time when our city was being showcased as a world-class 4th most livable city in the world. And yet our city is still struggling with very small microcosms that happened inside communities because we haven't quite got there around change and thinking about change. And I have an incredible mentor, Avi Friedman, that works at McGill, incredible housing advocate, urban planner. And he said to me one time, he's like, Teresa, the only thing of a certain about cities is that they're going to change. Change is, it's not like if it's going to come, it's when. And I think for me, if we can continue to work with our communities to pair change with these other incredible off-spins, like safe places to ride your bike and, not having to leave your neighborhood to get anything, doing like this. Paris is working on a 15-minute neighborhood where basically you can draw a circle around 15 minutes and you would never need to leave. To me, we all want that. We just call it something different. We all want to have a space where we don't have to leave our safety of our homes. We would love to be able to walk or drive our car 15 minutes, depending on how you go. But I think we're just about there. And I can't wait. Like, I've been here for 20 years and I say to my children, I'm like, in 20 years, my hope is that we'll like walk down the street and I'll be looking at things that we're working on now. And we'll see, these incredible redevelopments that happen that make that vision a reality.
Well, and you mentioned Paris. I mean, it feels like in so much of Paris, you're almost there. We're in that 15-minute zone where you can walk and get pretty much anything you need. When you mentioned Calgary, it actually reminds me, or just gives me the image of a kid in the last year of college getting straight A's, but still having temper tantrums when his bread isn't cut properly. These are big problems that you can deal with, but you're still crying about something that is so small. And Calgary has the opportunity, as many cities do, to punch well above its weight and, to be honest and to grow up. And that is both exciting, but sometimes troubling. Teresa, thank you so much for taking the time for this conversation. This has been really interesting and a lot of food for thought.
Thank you, Ben. I've enjoyed this.
To learn more about Teresa Goldstein, go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes, as well as the show notes for this episode. Those are all the things that we referenced and talked about, and the links to find out more about those things, video clips or audio clips, whatever it may be. Now, your quote of the week is from Socrates, who allegedly said, "By far the greatest and most admirable form of wisdom is that needed to plan and beautify cities and human communities." Thanks as always to our composer Andrea Wetstein for this wonderful music, and special thanks for Teresa for giving us the time to chat. Next up on this podcast is episode number 100, a retrospective edition of the podcast featuring me being interviewed by my friend Zaya Tong, author of The Reality Bubble and a previous guest of this podcast. The questions that Zaya will be asking are the ones that you give to her by social media. Please respond to any of the messages we've been putting out and let us know what questions you want to have asked of me based on the last 99 episodes of this podcast. It's What on Earth is Going On, in my perspective, based on 99 different guests. Take the time to send us a question and look out for the episode coming soon.